A chance in a million is another way of saying something is extremely unlikely to happen. It's an idiom used to emphasize the improbability of an event. When you say it was a chance in a million, you're expressing that the outcome was incredibly improbable. The following story was a chance in a million. In 1967, Nancy McEwen has suddenly driven off the Belt Parkway in New York into the median strip. A police lieutenant was in the car behind her and quickly pulled over. He found the teenager slumped forward in her car. He called for an ambulance, where they attempted to resuscitate Nancy McEwen at Coney Island Hospital. It all began at 8:40 a.m. on the morning of July the 8th, 1967, as Nancy McEwen, 17, was driving along the short parkway in Brooklyn, a few miles southeast of New York City. Nancy was on vacation and was in her new Chevrolet Camaro sports car and was driving towards her father's construction firm, where she was working for the summer. In the car behind Nancy was a plainclothes detective who thought it strange when a car began to veer to the right. As she veered, she did not indicate, and he presumed she was changing lanes. Her movement was gradual as she changed lanes, but he became concerned when she continued to drift first across one lane of the three lanes and then another and another. The next moment, Nancy's car went straight off the parkway, swiping and plunging into the thick roadside bushes where it crashed to a violent stop. Cars began to swerve and screech around the scene and proceeded to clog the freeway. Nancy was found slumped over the steering wheel with her hands in her lap. The detective and many witnesses who gathered around her car were observing a teenage girl who had died in an inexplicable manner. Nancy was a girl who was getting ready to go to college, who was here one day and gone the next. The police had her driver's license, her name and age, but no clue as to why she crashed the way she did. All personnel details indicated there was no history of epilepsy or diabetic seizures, and there were no marks on her body that they could initially see. The case of her mysterious death was put in the hands of a Brooklyn detective called Albert Seidman. Looking at her slumped body, they observed long blonde hair which covered her neck and the side of her face and the side of her head. They assumed that some mysterious ailment had caused her sudden death. At the time, Detective Seidman had no idea that it was about to take on this most baffling case while working at the NYPD. But it was not until doctors tried in vain to resuscitate her at Coney Island Hospital an hour later that they discovered that her unexpected cause of death was a small bloodless puncture wound that had been hidden by her long hair behind her left ear. There appeared no doubt that Nancy McEwen had been shot. The police had no clues whatsoever as to how someone dies under such unique and mysterious circumstances. It was Detective Seidman's difficult task to find out what happened and who would want to kill a girl that age in the prime of her life, and what their motive was to kill her. Who was angry enough to drive alongside her car and shoot her? Detective Seidman was quick to establish and was 100% sure that this was not a case of murder, as he later found that there was nobody travelling parallel with the girl's car and took a shot at her whilst they were moving along at the same speed. So they ruled out the possibility of a deliberate shooting, which leads to another possibility that it was totally random. The only window open in Nancy's car was the rear driver's side. The angle of the wound meant that the shot came from somewhere behind her car, passed through the open window and entered behind her ear as she was driving along the short parkway. No hitman was that good. Detective Seidman then ordered the police helicopter to fly down to the scene, where he went up to survey the entire area. After flying above the parkway and out towards the beach and across the water, forensic tests showed that the bullet came from a .303 Enfield rifle. This means that it could have been fired by any of the 2.5 million people living in that section of Brooklyn. Detective Seidman figured it had to have come from the beach, the marshes, or even from out at sea. Many officers complained that the odds of finding the shooter were virtually impossible and that he was wasting his time. Not to be deterred, Detective Seidman assembled a weekend search party. He said that somewhere out there, someone owned the .303 Enfield rifle and had fired it at 8:40 a.m. on the morning of Friday, July the 8th. They had no idea where to start, so Detective Simon looked at a map of South Brooklyn and said, "I'll tell you where do you start," and put his finger on the map and said, "Start on this particular street." The 1,000,000-to-1 odds that took Nancy McEwen's life would need to be repeated in order to solve the mystery of her death. 20 police officers were about to begin a search that was tantamount to looking for a needle in a haystack in a search for the gun that killed Nancy McEwen. The search crew scoured the beach in the marshes along Sheepshead Bay, looking for the shell casings, whilst others were sent into the thousands of rows of Brooklyn brownstones, multi-storey townhouses and tenements to knock on doors one at a time. On their third door knock, the police were on Knapp Street, east of the Belt Parkway. They approached a mobile gas station, and in the office was the owner, Theodore DeLisi, 47. It was only their third door knock in an area with millions of doors. The police asked DeLisi if he owned an Enfield British-made .303 rifle. DeLisi put his hand to his forehead, gasped, and told a story as incredibly simple as it was tragic. It was just like a 1 in a million chance that you were going to be successful. The following is an account of what happened in the tragic event. At 8:40 a.m. on the morning of July the 8th, 1967, DeLisi had been travelling on Sheepshead Bay in his boat to fish for bluefish in the ocean. He had bought the boat a few years ago, and the owner had thrown in an old Enfield .303 rifle with the boat. On this particular morning, heading through Rockaway Inlet and Sheepshead Bay, DeLisi had decided to test the old gun, which he might need for sharks. So he innocently fired towards a buoy, or what Americans call a buoy, in the water 20 yards from the boat. He then fired at a floating can, which he missed, but the bullet he fired into the water took on a course of its own. Detective Seidemann deduced that the bullet had ricocheted off the water as surely as if it had skimmed off a steel plate. From that instant, as Nancy McEwen was heading towards her father's construction firm on the Belt Parkway, in that 1,000,000-in-1 chance, the bullet had Nancy's name on it. All of this happened as the plainclothes detective was driving behind her car, unaware that the bullet was flying across Sheepshead Bay about 4 feet above the surface, where it passed over the sand dunes and Plum Beach, low across the reeds and marshes, unseen by Nancy as she drove completely unaware of its existence. Meanwhile, as this tragedy was unfolding, Theodore DeLisi was heading out to sea, believing that the bullet had sunk to the bottom of the bay, where in fact it had passed over the Plum Beach parking lot across the eastbound lane of the parkway, where it had travelled about a mile now and was losing its momentum. But as it cleared the medium strip divider, it began to drop. The bullet was near the end of its journey, but into its path came Nancy McEwen's Camaro, with only its small rear window open. Had that window been closed, the bullet would not have had the power to penetrate the glass and take her life, and behind her was a plainclothes detective who saw her car veer to the right ahead of her. Most certainly this was an accident and not an intentional shot. Authorities searched the dunes and marshes for a possible shell casing. When that wasn't successful, Seaman told his detectives to look for people who owned boats. They found a local gas station owner who was on his boat that morning taking target practice at a floating beer can. One of his bullets ricocheted off the water's surface and killed McEwen. It was a shot that came out of the blue and beat impossible odds to take a teenage girl's life, and was considered a shot in a million from a .303 rifle, and the chances of finding out how it happened were even more remote, because it could have been fired by almost anyone in the city of New York. The court case for Theodore DeLisi was reported in the New York Times with the following article. A Brooklyn grand jury found yesterday that there was not sufficient evidence to indict 47-year-old Theodore DeLisi of 78 Reed Avenue, Rockaway Point, in the fatal shooting of Nancy McEwen, 17, on the Belt Parkway last July the 8th. Homicide charges lodged against him have been dropped. Mr. DeLisi, who said at the time that he knew the young girl's family but not of her death, was arrested after scores of detectives had conducted 2,400 interviews on the fatality over a 6-day period. Mr. DeLisi testified that he had fired a high-powered rifle at a floating target in Gerriston Inlet. Miss McEwen was struck by a bullet as she drove her car to work. It could appear to be an accident, Assistant District Attorney Ben Abrams told the court when Mr. DeLisi was arraigned. The grand jurors, in an unusual move, filed a comment with their finding. It read, "The public interest requires that we express our grave concern over the availability of rifles and shotguns through the lack of state controls. Tragedies in which innocent people lose their lives might well be averted and crimes involving firearms curtailed if appropriate legislation were enacted." A grand jury ruled it an accident and did not bring homicide charges. The shooter was fined $100 for violating firearms laws with the rifle. An impossible angle, yet it happened.